Hey everybody, Alex Miller at Capnion here. In this video, I'd like to present something of a microeconomic case study from the 1980s about video games as a way of presenting a conversation piece, getting you started about consequences of AI beyond the kind of labor market apocalypse that we maybe more often like to focus on and be anxious about. In particular, it's kind of out of fashion these days, but it can maybe be a problem when there's just too much stuff to buy for too cheap. All of a sudden, markets can adapt and maybe something bad or weird happens. And then another point to emphasize here, and I feel really strongly about this one, observing a lot of conversation out there. We are not really at the point where AI is better at things than people. And I think the more intelligent, oh my God, AI kind of conversation is really about, well, AI can do a lot of things pretty well, and it's really fast and cheap, potentially, especially fast and accessible. So being able to do things fast and cheap and accessibly really is a huge deal from a business and an economic standpoint. It doesn't have to be true that AI does things better, and it doesn't. What's the case study? So probably if you're a video game fan or you've kept some nerdy company in your life, you're familiar with Atari. Trailblazing American video game company. Video games are so much part of the culture now, it's maybe difficult to remember a time when they weren't. So in the early 1980s, Atari was making video games. It was going pretty well. Something you might not know is not just anybody can come in off the street and make a PlayStation game or an Xbox game. You've got to get permission and a license to do this. And this is a response to what happened in the early 80s where anybody could make a video game. It's actually maybe not that hard absent these licensing things. And so people made a lot of bad games. And there was a time in the early 80s when you'd buy a box of cereal and it would have a video game cartridge in it for a terrible, terrible Atari game. So everybody was making these games. Lots of them were terrible. In one documentary I watched about this once, they're talking about you'd be at a store and there'd just be a huge bucket of video games all for 50 cents, just piled up. Like, who cares what they are? They're not even in boxes. And video games were a pretty new thing, and the jury was out. Is this thing going to stick around? Does anybody really care? This vaguely destroyed the brand of video games, in that the great mass of people, not being terribly focused, looked at the space, the product, the idea, and overwhelmingly associated with these gajillions of crap games. You could imagine, it's easy for us to imagine spending lots of money making a really brilliant video game with great visuals and great story and aggressive gameplay. And these days, to imagine that potential is standard. But it was a different time and it was new. And to most people, video games were buckets of trash at the grocery store for 50 cents. You'd buy 200 of them, plug them into your Atari. They're all terrible. Who cares? This dumb trend is not going anywhere. And so the market crashed. People lost interest. And this actually spiraled vaguely into the death of Atari. You could say Atari is kind of like the American Nintendo, and they're gone. And part of the story is this: things went differently in Japan. Nintendo was more careful about these kinds of things. The crash didn't happen over there, and video game culture later on, you might say, recolonized the United States from Japan. So to bring this back to AI, we talk about the labor market all the time. Well, what about the market for other goods? It's already happening, and you hear some chatter. I have heard interesting present-day case studies from other people, creative writing, for example, could be in danger of a situation like this. So it's very easy and fun, in my opinion, to make ChatGPT write terrible short stories for you. Short stories about anything you want very quickly, get 10 of them, send them to 10 different friends. I'm having a great time doing this, and if you know me well, you've probably been a victim of this habit of mine. But there's a real danger here in that institutions that are built around, generating short stories for money have a terrible quality control problem in it. Do you want to read thousands of Chat GPT generated submissions for your literary magazine? Is that really viable? And generally, there could be a situation where products, you might say, that are driven by human creativity are about to see, or are already seeing, a crazy glut of supply and really low quality supply. And what kind of effect is that going to have? Well, this 1983 Atari case study is an example of sometimes the effects can be pretty apocalyptic for an industry that loses control of its brand because of how much low quality stuff is being dumped on the market. And in the case of Atari and, in a way, Nintendo, the consequences can be very long-reaching. So look out for these things. Unfortunately, I think I would take my money to Vegas and bet you're going to see dynamics like this in coming years. My first guess is around fiction writing, but there are going to be others, and I would keep my eyes peeled. I think it's going to be really interesting. And a general point I would re-emphasize, I talk about in these videos, is the cultural consequences are going to be really significant as well, and we don't talk about those as much.